66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 12 kilometers across, wider than Mount Everest is tall, slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, traveling at 20 kilometers per second. That is more than 50 times the speed of a rifle bullet. The energy released was equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs detonating at the same instant. Within hours, everything within a 1,000-kilometer radius, an area larger than the state of Texas, was on fire. Within days, the sky went dark across the entire planet. Within months, roughly 76% of all species on Earth were dead. The oceans lost their mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. The skies lost their pterosaurs. On land, an entire dynasty of animals, sauropods and ceratopsians and tyrannosaurs, creatures that had dominated the planet for over 160 million years, roughly 800 times longer than modern Homo sapiens has existed, was erased in what amounts to a geological instant. So how did birds make it through? Because birds are dinosaurs. That is not a metaphor or a loose evolutionary comparison. Birds are theropod dinosaurs, direct descendants of the same lineage that produced Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus rex. They carry the same hollow bones, the same air sac respiratory system, the same basic skeletal architecture. When the asteroid hit and every other branch of the dinosaur family tree was permanently cut down, one group of small feathered theropods walked out the other side. And the answer to why they survived while everything around them perished involves burned forests, buried seeds, and a piece of anatomy so plain that it barely seems worth mentioning. Late Cretaceous Earth, 66 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000. The planet looked nothing like it does today. The continents were drifting toward their modern positions, but had not arrived. India was an island, racing north across the Tethys Sea toward a collision with Asia that would eventually raise the Himalayas, a construction project still tens of millions of years in the future. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower, roughly two-thirds its current width. North America was split down the middle by the Western Interior Seaway, a shallow, warm sea stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, turning the continent into two separate landmasses. You could not have walked from what is now Montana to what is now New York without swimming. And the planet was warm, far warmer than today. There were no permanent ice caps at either pole. Crocodilians lived above the Arctic Circle. Forests grew in Antarctica. Sea levels sat roughly 200 meters higher than they do right now, enough to submerge every modern coastal city, every port, every beachfront property on Earth. In this greenhouse world, dinosaurs were everywhere. They had been the dominant large land animals for over 160 million years. Tyrannosaurus rex stalked the floodplains of western North America, an animal weighing roughly 9 metric tons, heavier than an African bull elephant, with jaws that could splinter bone like dry kindling. Triceratops grazed in herds across the same river valleys, each animal carrying a 3-horned skull, wider than a kitchen table. Edmontosaurus, a duck-billed herbivore the length of a school bus, stripped vegetation from the forest margins. Ankylosaurus, armored like a living tank with a tail club capable of shattering femurs, lumbered through the undergrowth. In the oceans, mosasaurs stretched 15 meters long, longer than a city bus, hunting alongside giant sharks and spiraling ammonites. In the skies, pterosaurs soared on wingspans exceeding 10 meters in some species, wider than many single-engine aircraft. And among all of these animals, flying alongside the pterosaurs, nesting in the trees, picking through the leaf litter on the forest floor, were birds, millions of them. They had been part of the Mesozoic world for tens of millions of years by this point, descendants of small feathered theropods that had taken to the air long before the asteroid was even a distant speck in the solar system. But here is the detail buried in the fossil record that changes the entire story. There were two completely separate groups of birds alive in the late Cretaceous, and they were fundamentally different from each other. The first group was called the Enantiorniths, a name that translates roughly to opposite birds. They earned the name because a small bone in their shoulder girdle was fused in the reverse orientation compared to modern birds, a detail first described by paleontologist Cyril Walker at the Natural History Museum in London when he formally recognized the group in 1981. The Enantiornithes were spectacularly successful. They were the dominant birds of the Mesozoic era, far more diverse and ecologically varied than the second group. They nested in trees, they hunted insects on the wing. They occupied virtually every arboreal niche available to a small flying vertebrate. Many of them had teeth, small sharp teeth lining their jaws. useful for catching insects mid-flight or plucking prey off branches. Some had clawed fingers on their wings that let them grip bark and climb like feathered squirrels. They had been thriving for over 50 million years by the time the asteroid arrived. The second group was the neorniths, modern birds, your birds, the ancestors of every sparrow, every eagle, every penguin, every parrot alive today. In the late Cretaceous, they were the minority. Less diverse, less dominant, less ecologically impressive than their opposite bird cousins. Many of them lived on the ground rather than in the canopy. Many of them ate seeds and other hard plant material instead of insects. And critically, not a single one of them had teeth. Their jaws were sheathed in keratin, the same protein that makes up your fingernails. They had beaks. That distinction, teeth versus beak, canopy versus ground, would turn out to determine which lineage walked through the apocalypse and which one vanished forever. This decision seemed trivial at the time. It was not. The evidence for what killed the dinosaurs came together in stages, and the first breakthrough happened not at a fossil dig but in a chemistry laboratory in Berkeley, California. In 1980, physicist Luis Alvarez and his son Walter, a geologist at the University of California, Berkeley, along with nuclear chemists Frank Asaro and Helen Michel at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, published a paper in the journal Science that permanently changed how scientists understand mass extinctions. They have been studying a thin layer of clay at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the geological line that marks the end of the age of dinosaurs, exposed in a limestone gorge near the town of Gubbio in central Italy. When they tested the clay for trace elements, they found something extraordinary. The concentration of iridium, a metal that is vanishingly rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and meteorites, was roughly 60 times higher than normal background levels. That iridium anomaly was eventually confirmed at over 100 sites around the world, the same thin clay layer, the same spike in iridium. Something enormous, something from beyond Earth, had struck the planet at exactly the moment the dinosaurs disappeared. The Alvarez team proposed that an asteroid roughly 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter had hit the planet, thrown enough debris into the atmosphere to block sunlight for months, collapsed photosynthesis, destroyed food chains from the bottom up, and killed the majority of complex life on Earth. The idea sparked fierce controversy. Many geologists pushed back. Some pointed to the Deccan Traps, a massive volcanic province in what is now western India, where eruptions had been pouring staggering volumes of lava and toxic gas into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years around the same time. Perhaps volcanism, not an impact, was the real killer. The debate raged for over a decade. It was not settled until the crater itself was found. In 1991, Alan Hildebrand, then a doctoral student at the University of Arizona, identified a buried impact structure beneath the northern coastline of the Yucatan Peninsula, centered near a small fishing town called Chicxulub Puerto. The crater was roughly 180 kilometers across, about the distance from London to Birmingham, or from New York City to Hartford, Connecticut. It was one of the largest confirmed impact craters anywhere on Earth, and its age matched the iridium layer with precision that left almost no room for doubt. 25 years later, in 2016, the International Ocean Discovery Program launched Expedition 364 to drill directly into the peak ring of the Chicxulub crater. The team recovered rock cores from more than 1,300 meters below the seafloor, deeper than 4 Eiffel Towers stacked end to end. What they pulled up was granite that had been shattered, melted, and violently reassembled by forces beyond anything in human experience. The rock contained shocked quartz, a mineral that forms only under pressures exceeding 10 gigapascals, roughly 100,000 times normal atmospheric pressure at sea level. The evidence was unambiguous. Something massive had hit this exact spot, and it had hit hard enough to liquefy the bedrock itself. And the question of whether volcanism or the asteroid was the primary killer has largely been answered by subsequent research. Most studies published in the years since the drilling, including comprehensive modeling work by teams at Imperial College London and the University of Texas at Austin, conclude that the Chicxulub impact was the dominant cause of the extinction. The Deccan Traps volcanism was real and may have stressed ecosystems in the hundreds of thousands of years before impact, but the extinction itself, the sudden, catastrophic boundary event preserved in the geological record worldwide, aligns with the asteroid. What happened in the hours and days after that impact is the part of the story that explains why the killing was so thorough. and a fossil site in North Dakota captured the opening minutes of the catastrophe with a precision that paleontologists are still processing. In 2019, Robert De Palma, a paleontologist now at the University of Manchester, published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from a site called Tanis in the Hell Creek Formation of North Dakota, roughly 3,000 kilometers from where the asteroid struck. Tanis preserved a snapshot of the first hour after impact. De Palma's team found freshwater paddlefish and sturgeon, with tiny glass spherules, droplets of molten rock launched into the upper atmosphere by the collision, lodged in their gills. The fish had inhaled the falling ejecta as it rained down from the sky. They died within minutes, buried by a Seche wave, a standing wave and an inland waterway, triggered by the seismic shock that radiated outward from Chicxulub at roughly magnitude 11, stronger than any earthquake in recorded human history. The Tanis site contained more than fish. There were fragments of charred wood, tektites still embedded in amber, and the chemical signatures of a world being torn apart in real time. The site was a crime scene frozen at the moment of the crime, 3,000 kilometers from the murder weapon. The sequence of destruction unfolded in layers, each one worse than the last. First came the light. The impact flash was bright enough to ignite vegetation across hundreds of kilometers of Yucatan coastline. The thermal radiation pulse heated the upper atmosphere. Billions of tiny glass spherules, the re-entering ejecta launched by the collision, fell back through the atmosphere and generated enough frictional heat to raise surface temperatures across much of the planet to levels that could blister exposed skin. Forests on multiple continents ignited. Global wildfires swept through ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years. The soot from those fires rose into the stratosphere and stayed there. Then the darkness arrived. Sulfur-bearing rocks at the impact site, anhydrite and gypsum layers in the Yucatan bedrock, were vaporized by the collision and injected into the atmosphere. An estimated 325 gigatons of sulfur dioxide entered the stratosphere, roughly 1,000 times more sulfur than the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history has ever produced. This sulfur combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols that spread through the upper atmosphere and blocked incoming sunlight. Combined with the soot from the global fires, the aerosols reduced the sunlight reaching Earth's surface by as much as 99% in the weeks following impact. Photosynthesis did not slow down, it stopped entirely. The base of virtually every food chain on the planet was severed in a matter of weeks. Global temperatures plummeted. Climate models published by researchers at the Potsdam Institute and elsewhere estimate that average surface temperatures dropped by 20 to 30 degrees Celsius within the first year. The tropical forests that had blanketed much of the planet's landmass for millions of years froze. The shallow seas cooled rapidly. Organisms that had evolved for the warm, stable conditions of the Cretaceous suddenly found themselves in an environment more extreme than anything their lineage had experienced in over 100 million years. Then came the acid rain. Sulfuric acid falling from darkened skies lowered the pH of surface waters by 2 to 3 units, enough to dissolve the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms, enough to sterilize freshwater lakes and rivers. The chemistry of the oceans shifted. Corals, many species of plankton, and the ammonites that had populated the seas for hundreds of millions of years were devastated. And then the cold settled in and refused to leave. The impact winter lasted somewhere between 3 and 10 years, depending on which atmospheric model you consult. For that entire period, the planet was dark, freezing, acid-washed, and stripped of most of its primary producers. Anything that depended on a functioning food chain. Anything that ate plants that needed sunlight. Anything that ate animals that ate those plants was in desperate trouble. 76% of all species on Earth did not survive this sequence. In the oceans, every ammonite species, every mosasaur, every plesiosaur disappeared from the fossil record. On land, every non-avian dinosaur, every pterosaur, and most large reptiles were gone. The Cretaceous world, with its warm forests and spectacular megafauna, was finished. But some things came through. Crocodilians survived, likely because they could go months without eating, and lived in freshwater environments where detritus-based food chains persisted. Turtles survived, protected by their shells and their ability to hibernate. Small mammals survived, burrowed underground, feeding on insects and seeds and fungus. Freshwater fish, though hammered, persisted. And birds survived. But not all birds. That is the critical point that reframes the entire mystery. The Anantronyths, those dominant, tree-dwelling, toothed opposite birds that had been the most successful avian lineage for over 50 million years, were wiped out completely. Every species. The Hesper ornithiformes, a group of large toothed diving birds that had hunted fish in the western interior seaway, also vanished entirely. Toothed birds as a category ceased to exist. The only birds that made it through were the Neorniths, the beaked, ground-dwelling minority that had spent the Cretaceous living in the ecological shadow of their more successful cousins. And figuring out why required looking not at what killed the losers, but at what the survivors had that nobody else did. The fossil record held a clue that paleontologists took decades to fully understand. In 2016, Derek Larson, then working with the Royal BC Museum and the University of Toronto, published a study in Current Biology that examined over 3,000 teeth from small Maniraptoran theropods, the broader dinosaur group that includes birds, spanning the last 18 million years of the Cretaceous. The teeth came from the Hell Creek Formation and other late Cretaceous sites across western North America. Larson wanted to answer a simple question. Were these small dinosaurs and toothed birds already declining before the asteroid arrived? Had they been fading away, making the asteroid just the final blow to a group already on its way out? They were not declining at all. The dental diversity, meaning the full range of tooth shapes, and therefore the range of ecological niches these animals occupied, remained stable and healthy right up to the boundary layer. The toothed theropods and toothed birds were thriving until the moment the rock arrived. Their extinction was sudden and catastrophic, not gradual. This mattered because it ruled out a popular alternative explanation. If these groups had been declining for millions of years, you could argue that the asteroid merely finished off a lineage that was already doomed. Larson's data showed the opposite. They were doing fine. Something specific about the conditions created by the impact killed them selectively, while sparing the toothless, beaked Neorniths. The answer came 2 years later from a laboratory at the University of Cambridge, and it changed how paleontologists think about avian survival at the KPG boundary. In 2018, Daniel Field, a paleontologist at Cambridge, published a study in Current Biology that may be the single most important paper written about why birds survived the asteroid. Field and his colleagues, including Antoine Bercovici and Tyler Lyson, combined fossil pollen records from sites on multiple continents with phylogenetic analyses of modern bird lineages to reconstruct what happened to the planet's forests in the years immediately following the impact. What they found was devastating in its clarity. The global forest canopy did not just suffer damage, it collapsed entirely. Pollen records from the KPG boundary show a massive spike in fern spores, a signal paleobotanists call a fern spike, immediately above the iridium layer at sites across North America, Europe, and beyond. Ferns are the first plants to recolonize barren ground after a catastrophe. Their sudden dominance in the fossil record at this precise moment means that the world's forests had been reduced to ash and bare soil across vast stretches of the planet's land surface. The standing forests that had covered the continents for millions of years were gone. The implications for the two bird lineages were immediate and brutal. The Enantiorniths lived in trees. They nested in trees. They hunted from trees. Their wing claws were adapted for gripping bark. Their entire ecological existence was built around the forest canopy. When the forests burned and did not grow back for thousands of years, the Enantiorniths lost everything simultaneously. Their nesting sites vanished. Their hunting perches vanished. Their cover from predators vanished. Their insect-prey populations, which depended on the same forests, collapsed alongside the trees. The impact did not merely kill them with heat or cold or starvation. It destroyed the entire world they required in order to exist. Field's team then examined which bird lineages the phylogenetic data predicted had survived. The pattern was striking. Every surviving lineage was either ground-dwelling, shoreline-dwelling, or associated with open habitats rather than dense forest canopy. The ancestor of all modern birds, the small, generalist creature that passed through the bottleneck, was almost certainly a ground dweller, an animal that did not need a single standing tree to survive. Consider what that finding means for every owl, every woodpecker, every bird of paradise currently living in a forest canopy today. All of them descend from an ancestor that survived specifically because it did not depend on forests. Every modern forest bird is a secondary colonizer. Their ancestors returned to the trees millions of years later, long after the forests grew back. The original tree-dwelling birds, the enantiorniths, were gone permanently. The ecological role was the same. The occupants were entirely new. And this is where the beak becomes the most important piece of anatomy in the entire story of the KPG extinction. When the forests burned and the darkness descended and the food chains collapsed, what was left to eat on the bare, ash-covered ground? Insects were devastated, their populations cratering alongside the plants they depended on. Fruit was gone because the trees that bore fruit were gone. Fresh vegetation was dead or dying across whole continents. The photosynthetic base of the terrestrial food web had been cut. But seeds were still there, buried in the soil, waiting. Seeds are survival capsules. They are designed by hundreds of millions of years of plant evolution to endure harsh conditions, to lie dormant in the ground for months, years, sometimes decades, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. When the forests burned, the seeds did not burn with them. They were underground. They were insulated. And in the dark, freezing, ash-choked world that followed the impact, seeds represented one of the only remaining food sources on land that did not require a functioning ecosystem to exist. They were already there, already packaged, already loaded with the fats and proteins and carbohydrates that a small animal needed to survive. If you had a beak, you could crack those seeds open. You could process hard-shelled plant material that a toothed jaw was never designed to handle efficiently. Teeth are excellent tools for catching insects, for gripping slippery prey, for tearing flesh. They are not efficient instruments for cracking open the tough protective casings of dormant seeds buried in soil and ash. A beak, backed by a muscular gizzard filled with small stones that grind food internally, is exactly the right tool for that job. The neorniths had beaks. The enantiorniths had teeth. And in a world where seeds buried in the ash were one of the last reliable food sources left standing, that difference was the line between survival and oblivion. If you are finding this useful, subscribe now. This channel covers the events that shaped the planet long before recorded history began. And there is always another layer to uncover. While the beak versus teeth distinction was playing out across the ash-covered ground, another advantage was working quietly in the survivors' favor. One that had nothing to do with what they ate. Size. The ancestors of modern birds were small. Estimates based on phylogenetic reconstruction and the earliest Paleocene bird fossils suggest that the common ancestor of all living birds weighed somewhere around 1 kilogram, roughly the weight of a pigeon. Many of the surviving lineages were even smaller. The enantiorniths included a broader range of body sizes, from sparrow-sized species up to birds approaching the size of a wild turkey, and the larger members of the group were disproportionately vulnerable. This is an example of a broader pattern that paleontologists call the Lilliput effect, named after the fictional island of tiny people in Jonathan Swift's novel. After mass extinctions, the survivors tend to be small. The pattern repeats across multiple extinction events in the fossil record, not just the KPG. The mechanism is brutally straightforward. Smaller animals need less food. They can sustain themselves on fewer calories per day. In a world where photosynthesis has collapsed and entire ecosystems have been dismantled from the foundation up, the animals that can survive on the least have the best odds. A Tyrannosaurus rex needed to consume roughly 200 kilograms of meat per day, more than twice the weight of an average adult human, to fuel a body that weighed as much as a school bus. When the herbivores it hunted died, when the food chain that delivered those calories stopped functioning, an animal that size had nowhere to turn. It could not switch to seeds. It could not reduce its metabolic requirements. It starved. A 1-kilogram bird could survive on a few grams of seeds per day. It could exploit tiny patches of food that would be invisible to any large animal. It could shelter in rock crevices, hide in burrows, press itself against the ground, and endure conditions that would kill anything bigger than a house cat. There is something almost mathematically cruel about this. The same enormous body size that had made the dinosaurs dominant for 160 million years. The evolutionary strategy that let them outcompete every other group of large land animals across 3 geological periods became a death sentence the moment the food supply collapsed. The trait that built their empire was the trait that destroyed them. But the advantages that carried the surviving birds through the bottleneck extended beyond beaks and body size. The respiratory system of birds is unlike that of any other vertebrate alive today, and it may have provided a critical edge during the worst years of the impact aftermath. Birds breathe using a system of air sacs connected to rigid lungs through which air flows in a single direction, like a one-way highway. Mammalian lungs work differently. They inflate and deflate with each breath, pulling air in and pushing it out through the same passages, mixing fresh and stale air with every cycle. Bird lungs maintain a continuous one-way flow of fresh air across the gas exchange surfaces. The result is that birds extract oxygen from the air with dramatically greater efficiency than mammals or reptiles. In the aftermath of the Chicxulub impact, the atmosphere was loaded with particulate matter, soot from the global wildfires, sulfur aerosols, fine dust from the pulverized bedrock of the Yucatan. Oxygen levels may have fluctuated as fires consumed enormous quantities of organic material, and the shutdown of photosynthesis reduced oxygen replenishment. For an animal breathing through a less efficient respiratory system, these conditions could have been lethal even if food was available. For a bird, with unidirectional airflow and superior oxygen extraction, the same degraded air was survivable. Researchers have noted that this respiratory advantage may also help explain why the crocodilians, the birds' closest living relatives, also made it through the extinction. Crocodilians possess a similar unidirectional airflow system in their lungs, a feature inherited from the common archosaur ancestor they share with birds and dinosaurs. The animals with the most efficient breathing apparatus were disproportionately represented among the survivors, and the ones that lacked it were disproportionately represented among the dead. There is yet another factor that rarely gets the attention it deserves: the eggs. Most non-avian dinosaurs, based on fossil evidence in comparison with their closest living relatives, appear to have had remarkably long incubation periods. A 2017 study by Gregory Erickson of Florida State University, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, used growth lines in fossilized dinosaur teeth, lines that form daily like the rings in a tree trunk, to estimate how long dinosaur embryos spent developing inside their eggs. Erickson's team found that dinosaur eggs took between 3 and 6 months to hatch. Some of the larger species may have required incubation periods approaching 7 months, nearly as long as a human pregnancy. Compare that to modern birds, where incubation periods range from roughly 11 days for some small songbirds to about 80 days for the largest species like ostriches and albatrosses. The common ancestor of modern birds almost certainly had an incubation period measured in weeks, not months. In a post-impact world, every day spent sitting on a nest was a day of extreme vulnerability. Every additional month of incubation was a month during which the egg could be killed by cold, by the starvation of the parent, by predation, by the relentless hostility of a world that no longer supported the conditions the embryo required. A lineage that could go from freshly laid egg to hatching chick in 2 or 3 weeks held a massive advantage over one that required half a year to accomplish the same thing. Faster reproduction meant faster population recovery. It meant the survivors could rebound from the bottleneck more quickly, establishing themselves in vacant ecological niches before any competitor could gain a foothold. And the bottleneck was severe. Genetic studies of modern bird lineages, comparing the molecular divergence times of different bird families, suggest that the number of neornithe species that actually made it through the extinction event was remarkably small. Estimates vary depending on the study and the methodology, but some analyses suggest that fewer than a few hundred species survived the boundary, possibly far fewer. From that small, battered population of survivors descended every one of the roughly 11,000 species of birds alive today, every ostrich and every hummingbird, every penguin and every albatross, every eagle and every flamingo. All of them trace their ancestry back to that small population of beaked, ground-dwelling generalists that ate seeds in darkness while the world around them burned and froze and choked. The recovery, when it finally came, was one of the most explosive radiations in the history of life on Earth. Within the first few million years after the extinction, the surviving bird lineages began diversifying into the ecological niches that had been violently emptied. With the pterosaurs gone, the skies belonged to the birds alone for the first time. With the large non-avian dinosaurs gone, opportunities on the ground opened up that had not existed for over 160 million years. Some bird lineages responded by growing enormous. Gastornis, a flightless bird that stood nearly 2 meters tall, roughly the height of a professional basketball player, appeared in the recovering forests of Europe and North America within 10 million years of the extinction. In South America, the forest racids, commonly known as terror birds, evolved into apex predators that ruled the continent for over 40 million years. The largest species stood 3 meters tall and weighed half a metric ton, roughly the mass of a grand piano. They were the ecological successors to the theropod dinosaurs that had vanished, and they filled the predator role with savage efficiency. Other lineages went in the opposite direction, becoming smaller, more specialized, more varied. The passerines, the perching birds, which today account for more than half of all living bird species, underwent a spectacular adaptive radiation that filled every conceivable niche, from insect-catching warblers to seed-cracking finches to nectar-drinking sunbirds. Raptors evolved to fill the small predator roles left vacant by the extinction of dromaeosaurids and troodontids. Waterbirds diversified into the shorebird, seabird, and waterfowl lineages that dominate aquatic and coastal ecosystems today. The speed of this diversification was remarkable by any standard. A landmark 2014 study led by Eric Jarvis of Duke University, published in the journal Science, used whole genome sequencing of 48 bird species to construct the most comprehensive avian family tree ever assembled at that time. The data revealed that the major bird lineages diverged within a surprisingly narrow window of time shortly after the KPG boundary, a burst of speciation so rapid and so explosive that Jarvis and his colleagues described it as a, quote, big bang of avian evolution. In the space of roughly 10 to 15 million years, a span that sounds enormous to a human lifespan but is remarkably compressed by evolutionary standards, the surviving birds had filled most of the major ecological roles they occupy today. This is the paradox that sits at the center of every natural history museum's extinction exhibit. The worst catastrophe in the history of complex animal life, an event that killed 3 out of every 4 species on the planet, was simultaneously the single greatest opportunity in the history of birds. Without the asteroid, the Enantiorniths would almost certainly still dominate the forest canopies and the skies. The Neorniths would likely remain a minor, unremarkable lineage of ground-foraging generalists. There would be no eagles, no songbirds, no hummingbirds, no penguins. The birds outside your window exist because of the worst day in the history of the planet. And the deeper you examine the survival factors, the more unsettling the specificity becomes. Being small was not sufficient on its own. Plenty of small non-avian dinosaurs were small, and they all died. Feathers did not guarantee survival. The Enantiorniths were fully feathered, and every species perished. Evidence increasingly suggests that many non-avian dinosaurs maintained warm-blooded metabolisms, and that advantage alone did not save them. Flight offered no protection, because the pterosaurs could fly and they vanished. The Enantiornithes could fly and they vanished. You needed to be small and beaked and ground-dwelling and capable of eating seeds, and equipped with a highly efficient respiratory system, and able to reproduce quickly. You needed all of those traits operating at once. Any single advantage in isolation was not enough. Survival at the KPG boundary was not about possessing one lucky trait. It was about holding a specific combination of characteristics that happened to align with the specific combination of lethal challenges the asteroid created. The beaked, ground-dwelling Neorniths did not survive because they were inherently superior to the Enantiorniths. They survived because Chicxulub created a world that they, and nearly only they, were accidentally pre-adapted to endure. If the asteroid had struck an area without sulfur-rich bedrock, the impact winter might have been shorter. The forests might not have collapsed so completely. The Enantiornithes might have survived in reduced numbers. and the entire trajectory of bird evolution, and therefore the entire composition of the modern world's avian fauna, would be different. If the asteroid had been slightly smaller, or had arrived at a slightly different angle, the extinction might have been less severe. Dinosaurs might still dominate the land, and you almost certainly would not exist. The mammals that eventually produced your own lineage were only able to diversify into large body sizes and new ecological roles because the dinosaurs were gone. The same catastrophe that made modern birds possible also made modern mammals possible. It made primates possible. It made you possible. The asteroid that ended the Mesozoic era did not just destroy a world. It created the conditions for the world you currently inhabit. Every pigeon pecking at crumbs on a city sidewalk is a living dinosaur. Every sparrow on a telephone wire outside a suburban kitchen window. Every crow picking through a parking lot. Every parrot screaming in a pet store. When a paleontologist says, non-avian dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, the qualifier, non-avian, is doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence. The avian dinosaurs, the ones with beaks and hollow bones and efficient lungs and fast-hatching eggs, the ones that ate seeds in the dark while the rest of the dynasty burned, survived. They did not just survive, they flourished. There are roughly 11,000 species of them alive right now. They live on every continent, including Antarctica. They range in size from the bee hummingbird of Cuba, which weighs less than a United States penny, to the common ostrich, which can exceed 150 kilograms, heavier than 2 adult humans standing on the same scale. They have colonized every habitat on the planet, from the open ocean to the peaks of the Himalayas, from the sand dunes of the Sahara to the deepest canopy layers of the Amazon rainforest. They are, by species count, the most diverse group of land vertebrates on Earth. The dinosaurs did not go extinct 66 million years ago. Most of them did. The large ones, the spectacular ones, the ones that fill museum halls and children's imaginations, those are gone. But the small, plain, seed-eating survivors that no one would have noticed in a Cretaceous forest became the most species-rich land vertebrate lineage the planet has ever produced. They are everywhere around you. You hear them every morning before your alarm goes off. And every single one of them carries the biological legacy of an ancestor that was small enough, flexible enough, and just lucky enough to find food in the dark while the rest of the world burned down around it. The mechanisms that drove that extinction, asteroid impacts, volcanic climate disruption, rapid ecological collapse, are not relics of the deep past. They are features of the same planetary system you inhabit right now. The geological record does not describe a world that used to be dangerous. It describes a world that has always been dangerous and happens to be calm at the moment. The question is not whether the same forces could reshape the biosphere again. The question is what will be small enough and adaptable enough to walk out the other side when they do. If you want to see what else the geological record reveals about the events that shaped this planet before anyone was around to write them down, click the video on screen now.